In a quiet Georgia town where Sunday service was sacred and everyone knew their neighbor's business, a preacher's wife stood before her congregation and made an announcement that would shatter their world. She was pregnant, she declared, but not by her husband, not by any man. God himself had chosen her, blessed her, made her the vessel for a divine child. The congregation didn't know whether to fall to their knees in worship or run screaming from the church. But that was only the beginning, because when that child was born, things started happening, things that no one could explain, things that made believers question their faith and skeptics question their sanity. This is the true story of Miriam Caldwell, the preacher's wife who claimed divine pregnancy, and the child whose birth unleashed something that a small town was never prepared to face. If you're drawn to stories that blur the line between faith and madness, between miracle and nightmare, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. These are the stories that challenge everything we think we know about belief, reality, and the darkness that can hide behind holy words. Let's begin. Redemption Baptist Church sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street in Crestwood, Georgia, a town of 200 souls nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The church had been there since 1887, a white clapboard building with a steeple that could be seen from anywhere in town. On clear Sundays, the church bells rang across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. It was 1996, and Reverend Thomas Caldwell had been the pastor for 8 years, respected and loved by his congregation of 230 regular attendees. Thomas Caldwell was 41 years old, tall and lean with graying hair, and a warm smile that made people feel heard. He had a gift for preaching that was neither fire and brimstone nor watered-down feel, good theology, but something in between, accessible and genuine. His wife Miriam was 36, a former elementary school teacher who had left her job when they married to focus on church duties. She taught Sunday school, organized potlucks, visited the sick, and played piano during services. To everyone who knew them, the Caldwells were the ideal pastoral couple, devoted to God and to each other. But the Caldwells had a sorrow that everyone in town knew about, the kind of sorrow that people whispered about with sympathy and awkward comfort. They had been trying to have children for 14 years without success. Miriam had endured 3 miscarriages and countless medical consultations. The congregation had prayed for them regularly, laid hands on Miriam's womb during special services, and organized prayer chains that spanned months. Nothing had worked. By 1996, most people assumed the Caldwells had accepted their childlessness as God's mysterious will. The announcement came during Sunday service on March 17, 1996. Thomas had just finished his sermon on the nature of faith when Miriam, who had been seated in her usual spot in the front pew, stood up and walked to the pulpit. Thomas looked surprised but stepped aside. The congregation fell silent. Miriam's hands were shaking as she gripped the sides of the pulpit, but her voice was clear and strong. She told them that 3 months earlier, on December 12th, she had been praying in the church sanctuary alone late at night. She had been asking God, once again, why she had been denied the blessing of children. And then, she said, the sanctuary had filled with light, brilliant and warm, and she had felt a presence, something vast and loving and terrible all at once. She had heard a voice, not with her ears but inside her mind, telling her that she had been chosen, that she would bear a child who would do great things, that this child would be a sign to the faithful. The congregation sat frozen as Miriam continued. She had, she said, felt a physical sensation at that moment, something entering her, filling her, and she had known with absolute certainty that she was pregnant. When she returned home and told Thomas, he had been skeptical and concerned. But 2 weeks later, a pregnancy test had confirmed what she already knew. She was pregnant, and the child, she declared with tears streaming down her face, had been placed in her womb by God himself. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some people began to cry and pray. Others sat in stunned silence. A few got up and walked out. Thomas stood beside his wife, his face pale, looking like a man who had been struck by lightning. After the service ended in chaos, with people crowding around Miriam or fleeing to their cars, Thomas retreated to his office and didn't emerge for hours. The story spread through Crestwood like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone in town had heard that the preacher's wife was claiming a virgin birth. Reactions split along predictable lines. The deeply faithful saw it as a miracle, a sign that God still moved in the world in powerful ways. The skeptical saw it as delusion or deception, and many fell somewhere in between, wanting to believe but troubled by the implications. Thomas Caldwell found himself in an impossible position. His wife, whom he loved and had always trusted, was making a claim that seemed insane. But she was also genuinely pregnant after 14 years of infertility, which no one disputed. Medical records confirmed it. He knew with certainty that he had not had relations with his wife around the time of conception. They had both been dealing with a severe flu in early December and had been too ill for intimacy. So either Miriam was lying about an affair, which seemed utterly out of character, or she genuinely believed what she was saying, or something impossible had actually happened. In the weeks following the announcement, Thomas conducted his own investigation. He checked their bank records, phone records, Miriam's schedule, looking for any evidence of an affair. He found nothing. He spoke with Miriam's doctor, who confirmed the pregnancy was progressing normally and that yes, the conception date would have been around mid-December. He spoke with Miriam herself, long tearful conversations where he begged her to tell him the truth. She never wavered. God had done this. There was no other explanation. The church board called an emergency meeting. The discussions were heated and painful. Some board members wanted to dismiss Thomas immediately, arguing that his wife's claims were blasphemous, and that his inability to control or correct her made him unfit for leadership. Others defended the Caldwells, arguing that stranger things had happened in the Bible, and that dismissing a miracle out of hand showed a lack of faith. The board ultimately voted to place Thomas on temporary leave while they monitored the situation, a decision that satisfied no one. As Miriam's pregnancy progressed, strange things began to happen. The first incident occurred in late April, during a prayer meeting at the home of Eleanor Briggs, one of Miriam's closest friends. About 15 women had gathered, and Miriam was there despite her controversial status. During the prayer, one woman, Patricia Hendricks, suddenly began speaking in what sounded like a foreign language, harsh and guttural. Patricia had never spoken in tongues before, and would later claim she had no memory of doing so. When the episode ended, she collapsed, and when she came to, she said she had seen Miriam surrounded by flames that didn't burn. The second incident happened at the church itself. The new interim pastor, Reverend Martin Shaw, brought in from a neighboring town, was preparing his sermon in Thomas's old office when he heard singing. He went into the sanctuary and found it empty, but the singing continued, a woman's voice he didn't recognize, singing in a language he couldn't identify. He searched the entire building and found no source. The singing stopped abruptly when he approached the altar. By May, the divisions in Crestwood had hardened into something ugly. Families stopped speaking to each other. Friendships ended over arguments about Miriam's claim. The church attendance dropped by half, with some people leaving because they believed Miriam was a false prophet leading people astray, and others leaving because they believed the church board had failed to recognize a genuine miracle. Thomas and Miriam became increasingly isolated, invited nowhere, welcomed nowhere. The media got hold of the story in June. A reporter from Atlanta came to do a feature on the Georgia miracle baby. The story ran with heavy skepticism, interviewing psychologists who discussed delusional disorders and religious mania. Miriam refused to be interviewed, but the reporter managed to get comments from various townspeople, painting a picture of a small town torn apart by religious fervor. The national attention only made things worse. Miriam's behavior during the pregnancy became increasingly erratic, at least according to those who saw her. She claimed to hear voices giving her instructions. She said angels visited her at night. She began having visions that she described in vivid detail. Cities of light, creatures with too many eyes, prophecies about the future. Thomas watched his wife slip further into what he feared was madness, but every attempt to get her psychiatric help was met with fierce resistance. She wasn't crazy, she insisted. She was chosen. The pregnancy itself was medically normal. Miriam's doctor, Barbara Chen, kept meticulous records. All the tests and ultrasounds showed a healthy developing fetus. Dr. Chen privately told Thomas that regardless of how the conception occurred, Miriam was carrying a normal human baby. This information didn't comfort Thomas much. Either his wife had had an affair and constructed an elaborate delusion, or something impossible had happened. Neither option allowed him to sleep at night. The child was born on September 3, 1996, at Crestwood Community Hospital. It was a normal birth, lasting 7 hours with no complications. The baby was a boy, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, perfectly healthy. Miriam named him Samuel after the prophet. Thomas was in the delivery room, and witnesses later said he wept when he held his son, though whether from joy or grief or confusion, no one could say. They brought Samuel home on September 5th. And that's when things got truly strange. The first night home, Thomas and Miriam were awakened at 3 in the morning by every electronic device in the house turning on simultaneously. The television, radio, computer, alarm clocks, all blaring at full volume. Thomas rushed through the house, turning everything off, checking for electrical problems. He found none. The baby slept through the entire incident. The second night, Miriam woke to find Samuel's crib surrounded by what she described as shadows that moved with purpose, circling the baby. She screamed, and Thomas came running. He saw nothing unusual, but when he picked up Samuel, the baby was ice cold despite the warm room and heavy blankets. They rushed him to the hospital, but by the time they arrived, his temperature was normal. Doctors found nothing wrong. The incidents escalated. Objects in the house would move on their own, doors slamming, pictures falling from walls, furniture rearranging overnight. The Caldwell's neighbor, Roy Patterson, claimed he saw lights in the Caldwell house at night that didn't look like any normal illumination, pulsing and shifting in color. Another neighbor, Susan DeMarco, said she heard chanting coming from the house in a language she'd never heard before, though when she approached, it stopped. By October, the Caldwells were prisoners in their own home. Thomas had lost his position at the church permanently. Miriam rarely left the house, claiming that people cursed her and the baby when they went out. Samuel was developing normally according to his pediatric checkups, but even the pediatrician, Dr. James Knowles, admitted there was something unsettling about the child. He was too quiet, too watchful for an infant. His eyes seemed to track things that weren't there. The breaking point came on October 27th. Eleanor Briggs, Miriam's friend who had hosted the prayer meeting months earlier, came to visit. She brought food and baby gifts, trying to show support despite the town's hostility. She stayed for an hour, holding Samuel, chatting with Miriam. Everything seemed normal, but when Eleanor got home, she began to feel ill. By evening, she was vomiting and feverish. By midnight, she was in the hospital with symptoms the doctors couldn't explain: intense pain, seizures, speaking in confused fragments about darkness and flames. Eleanor spent 3 days in the hospital. When she recovered, she refused to speak about what had happened, but she made it clear she would never return to the Caldwell house. Word spread that somehow Samuel had made Eleanor sick, that the child was cursed or possessed or evil. The few people who had still been supporting the Caldwells pulled away. Thomas finally contacted Father Michael Donnelly, a Catholic priest from a parish 30 miles away, who had a reputation for dealing with unusual spiritual situations. Father Donnelly agreed to visit the house, not to perform an exorcism. He was careful to specify, but to assess the situation and offer counsel. He arrived on November 3rd, carrying his rosary and prayer book, prepared for anything. What Father Donnelly found was a house that felt, in his words, oppressive and watched. He spent several hours with the family, praying with them, asking questions, observing Samuel. The baby was now 2 months old, alert and healthy by all appearances. But Father Donnelly later told colleagues that being in the child's presence felt like standing near a storm that hadn't broken yet, all potential energy and pressure. Father Donnelly recommended that the family move away from Crestwood, start fresh somewhere no one knew their story. He also gently suggested that Miriam might benefit from counseling to help her process whatever she had experienced. He did not say the child was possessed or evil, but he also did not say the child was blessed. He simply said the situation was beyond his understanding, and that the family needed space to heal away from the town's judgment. The Caldwells took his advice. In late November, they packed up and left Crestwood. Thomas had accepted a position at a small church in Florida that was willing to hire him despite the controversy. They left in the night, telling no one they were going, and by morning they were gone. But the story didn't end there. In the months following their departure, strange incidents continued in Crestwood. People who had been particularly vocal in condemning Miriam reported nightmares, seeing a woman surrounded by light who stared at them with burning eyes. Others reported hearing crying babies in their homes when no babies were present. One woman, Martha Reynolds, who had called Miriam a whore from the pulpit, found all of her mirrors shattered one morning with no explanation. Reverend Martin Shaw, the interim pastor, left Crestwood after only 6 months, refusing to explain why except to say he didn't feel called to serve there anymore. The next 3 pastors who came to Redemption Baptist also left quickly, and eventually the church closed its doors. The building still stands but remains empty. No congregation willing to meet there. Investigators and paranormal enthusiasts descended on Crestwood in 1997, after the story gained wider attention. They interviewed townspeople, examined the Caldwell house which had been abandoned and never re-sold, and documented the various strange occurrences. No definitive conclusions were reached, but the consensus was that something had happened in Crestwood, something that defied easy explanation. Thomas Caldwell resurfaced publicly in 2003, giving a single interview to a religious magazine. He described the ordeal as the darkest period of his life, and admitted he still didn't know what to believe about Samuel's conception. He said that Miriam had never confessed to an affair, that he had never found evidence of one, and that the medical impossibility of the timing still troubled him. He described Samuel as a normal, happy 7-year-old who loved soccer and cartoons. The strange incidents, he said, had stopped about a year after they left Georgia. Miriam Caldwell never spoke publicly about what happened. She died in 2008 from cancer at the age of 48. In her final weeks, she reportedly told a nurse that she had been telling the truth all along, that God had chosen her, and that she had no regrets. Whether this was genuine conviction or the comfort of a dying woman clinging to her beliefs, no one can say. Samuel Caldwell is now in his late 20s. He lives under a different name, his identity protected by his father and those who know the story. According to the few reports that have emerged, he's a normal adult, employed, in a relationship, living an ordinary life. He has never given any interviews or made any public statements about his mother's claims or his unusual birth. The question that haunts everyone who knows this story is, what really happened? The skeptical explanation is straightforward. Miriam had an affair, became pregnant, and constructed an elaborate religious delusion to hide her infidelity. The psychological stress of this deception, combined with the town's reaction, created a hysterical environment where normal coincidences were interpreted as supernatural events. It's a clean explanation that accounts for all the facts. But it doesn't quite fit. The timeline of conception, verified by multiple doctors, occurred during a period when Thomas and Miriam were both severely ill, and when Miriam's whereabouts were accounted for by multiple witnesses. For an affair to have occurred, it would have required extraordinary deception and planning that seems inconsistent with Miriam's character and the practical constraints of small town life where everyone watches everyone else. The alternative explanation, that Miriam's claim was literally true, opens up theological and philosophical questions that challenge everything we think we know about reality. If God can impregnate a woman in modern Georgia, what does that mean about the nature of God, of miracles, of the boundary between the divine and the mundane? And if this child was truly placed in Miriam's womb by divine intervention, what was the purpose? The child grew up normal, as far as anyone knows. There was no ministry, no healing, no prophecies fulfilled. Just a normal kid and a destroyed family. There's a third possibility that few people want to consider. That something happened to Miriam, something neither natural nor divine, but something else entirely. The vivid visions, the strange phenomena surrounding the baby, the way the entire town seemed to be affected, all suggest an experience that doesn't fit neatly into either secular or traditional religious frameworks. Some researchers have suggested sleep paralysis combined with psychogenic pregnancy, but this doesn't account for the actual baby or the witnessed phenomena. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a psychologist who studied the case extensively, proposed that Miriam experienced a genuine altered state of consciousness during her late-night prayer session, possibly induced by stress, sleep deprivation, and intense emotional need. In this state, she may have had an experience that felt absolutely real, an encounter with what she interpreted as God. The pregnancy, which likely occurred through normal means at roughly the same time, became linked in her mind with this experience. Her absolute conviction then created a kind of shared hysteria in the town, where people began interpreting coincidences through a supernatural lens. But Dr. Hayes admitted her theory had gaps. It didn't explain the timing issues, or why Miriam never confessed to an affair, even in private to Thomas. It also didn't account for some of the more dramatic phenomena, unless you attributed all of it to mass hysteria and exaggeration, which Dr. Hayes felt was too dismissive of multiple credible witnesses. The case has been compared to other historical claims of miraculous pregnancies and possessed children, from medieval saints who claimed divine conception to modern cases of children supposedly showing supernatural abilities. Scholars note that such claims tend to emerge from communities under stress, where traditional belief systems are being challenged or where individuals feel powerless. Miriam, unable to have children and perhaps feeling her life's purpose slipping away, may have been psychologically primed for an experience that gave her significance and meaning. The tragedy of the Caldwell case is that regardless of what actually happened, real people suffered real consequences. Miriam lived the rest of her life as either a blessed prophet or a deluded adulteress, depending on who was judging her. Thomas lost his career and his community. Samuel grew up knowing his very existence was controversial, and an entire town was torn apart by divisions that some say never fully healed. Redemption Baptist Church still stands empty on the corner of Maple and 3rd. The Caldwell house was eventually demolished in 2015 after years of vandalism and decay. Most of the key figures in the story have died or moved away. Crestwood itself has changed, younger people moving in who don't know the story or dismiss it as old gossip. But long-time residents remember. They remember the Sunday morning when Miriam Caldwell announced her divine pregnancy. They remember the split that followed. And they remember the strange months when it seemed like something had settled over their town. Something that watched and waited and unsettled everything they thought they knew. Father Donnelly, who visited the Caldwells that November day in 1996, died in 2019. Before his death, he gave an interview where he was asked directly, "Do you think Samuel Caldwell was the product of divine intervention?" His answer was carefully worded. He said that in his years as a priest, he had encountered many things he couldn't explain, and he had learned to be humble about declaring what was or wasn't possible. He said that whatever happened in the Caldwell house, he had felt a presence there, something powerful and ambiguous, neither clearly good nor clearly evil, but simply other. He added that the question of Samuel's origin might be less important than the question of why this particular family, in this particular town, at this particular time. What was the meaning, the message, the purpose? If it was a test of faith, everyone seemed to have failed. If it was a miracle, it was one wrapped in darkness and confusion. If it was delusion, it was one that left physical and psychological scars that lasted years. The case file on the Caldwell incident, maintained by several researchers interested in religious phenomena, remains open. New information occasionally surfaces. Someone remembers something they hadn't thought important at the time, or an old letter or diary entry comes to light. But the central mystery remains unsolved and perhaps unsolvable. Did Miriam Caldwell have an affair and invent an elaborate lie? Did she experience a genuine psychotic break that manifested as religious delusion? Or did something happen to her in that church sanctuary on December 12, 1995? Something that no scientific framework or theological tradition can adequately explain. What we're left with is a story that challenges us to examine our assumptions about reality, faith, and the limits of human understanding. It's easy to dismiss Miriam as delusional or deceptive, but that dismissal requires ignoring uncomfortable details. It's equally tempting to embrace her claim as a miracle, but that embrace requires accepting implications that strain credulity. The truth, as is often the case in the most compelling mysteries, likely lies somewhere in the complicated space between certainty and doubt. Samuel Caldwell, wherever he is, whatever name he goes by, carries with him the weight of unanswerable questions. He is either an ordinary man with an extraordinary origin story, or he is simply an ordinary man whose mother's mental illness created mythology around his conception. He may not know himself which is true. Perhaps it doesn't matter. He exists, he lives, he continues, and the mystery of his beginning doesn't change the reality of his present. The town of Crestwood continues as well, though the empty church remains a reminder of what happened there almost 3 decades ago. Some buildings carry the weight of history, and some stories refuse to be forgotten. The Caldwell case is both a wound in the town's collective memory that never quite healed, a question mark that still hangs in the air whenever old-timers gather and conversation turns to the strange and unexplained. In the end, the story of Miriam Caldwell and her supposed divine pregnancy forces us to confront the limits of our understanding. We want definitive answers, clear categories, explanations that satisfy. But some experiences resist explanation. Some claims cannot be proven or disproven, and some mysteries remain mysteries, no matter how deeply we investigate, no matter how much we want resolution. Whether you believe Miriam was blessed, deluded, or lying, her story serves as a reminder that faith and doubt are not opposites but companions, that the human need for meaning can lead us to extraordinary claims, and that sometimes the most unsettling stories are the ones that refuse to provide us with comfortable conclusions. The preacher's wife said God impregnated her, A child was born, strange things happened, and a town was never quite the same. That much is certain. Everything else remains in the realm of belief, interpretation, and mystery.